Today's episode is brought to you by Beam. Transform your sleep with Beam's Dream. It's the secret behind 15 million nights of improved sleep. Let me tell you what's going to happen. You're going to use Beam's Dream, you're going to fall asleep faster, stay asleep longer, and you're going to wake up refreshed. Get up to 40% off at Shop Beam, that's B-E-A-M, shopbeam.com/PDB, and use the code PDB. It's Tuesday, 9 April. Welcome to the President's Daily Brief. I'm Mike Baker, your eyes and ears on the world stage. Let's get briefed. We'll kick off today's show with recent comments from Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who insists that Ukraine is destined to become a NATO member. We'll take a look at what Blinken said, and I'll explain why Ukraine isn't likely to get a key to the NATO clubhouse anytime soon. And by the way, it's not just a key. NATO members, I understand, also get a very cool decoder ring, NATO-branded beer koozies, and a swank satin members-only NATO jacket. All right, coming up later in the show, we'll turn our attention to China, where U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is wrapping up a series of high-level meetings. Yellen delivered a message to Beijing, warning of sanctions if Beijing aids Russia's war machine. Now, somebody needs to tell the Treasury Secretary that China has been aiding Russia's war machine for some time now. Plus, we'll examine recent reports that China is targeting voters in the U.S. and Taiwan using AI-powered disinformation. And I, for one, am going to use ChatGPT to write an essay about just how shocked I am over the Xi regime's shenanigans. And in today's Back of the Brief, an update on the situation in Haiti, where chaos is still ruling the streets, and the U.S. government has announced it's bringing an end to charter flights out of the troubled country. But first, today's PDB Spotlight. Last week marked the 75th anniversary of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the Western military alliance formed to counterbalance Soviet aggression back in 1949. As most of you are aware, NATO has expanded significantly since its creation. The alliance began with 12 founding members, including the U.S., Great Britain, and France, but has grown to include 32 members over the past 7.5 decades. The most recent nations to join, of course, are Sweden and Finland. Both got their membership cards this past year. Now, some Western leaders are hoping that membership will grow by at least one in the future. During a meeting of NATO leaders in Brussels last week, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken told reporters, quote, "Ukraine will become a member of NATO. Our purpose at the summit is to help build a bridge to that membership," end quote. Now, it's worth noting that becoming a member of NATO is actually part of the Ukrainian constitution, and the alliance is very popular in the country. In 2019, then Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko signed a constitutional amendment committing the country to eventually becoming a member. However, the prospect of Ukraine joining NATO has given rise to a great deal of concern, not to mention angst, in the West. That hesitation arises from NATO's Article 5, which lays out the principle of what's called collective defense, commonly termed, quote, "an attack on one is an attack on all." Article 5 has been invoked really only once in NATO's history. That's it, following the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks against the U.S. But many critics believe that Ukraine's inclusion in the alliance would all but guarantee direct confrontation between the alliance and Russia. However, while Ukraine certainly has ambitions to join, and some NATO leaders would like to facilitate its entrance, the chance that it's going to happen anytime soon is remote, possibly even very remote. For starters, the most significant hurdle that Ukraine faces is the principle within NATO's guidelines that prevents countries with unresolved territorial conflicts from joining. This is to avoid, of course, the very situation that critics fear, that the alliance would be dragged into immediate military engagements under Article 5. Now, Ukraine, embroiled in a war with Russia since 2014, does not meet this criteria. The conflict, especially after the 2022 full-scale invasion by Putin, has left Ukraine with contested territories in its south and its east, namely the Donbas region, which is currently under Russian military occupation, as well as Crimea, which Russia claims to have annexed. NATO members are wary of extending the alliance's security commitments to a nation where conflict is active, fearing it could trigger a broader war with Russia, which of course is a nuclear-armed state. Moreover, NATO operates by consensus, meaning that all member countries must agree to admit a new member. Now, given the complexities and risks associated with Ukraine's current situation, achieving unanimous support would be almost impossible. While many NATO members have expressed solidarity with Ukraine, providing military aid and imposing sanctions on Russia, they'd undoubtedly stop short of supporting its immediate membership to avoid escalating tensions with Moscow. So while Ukraine's aspirations to join NATO are supported by many within the alliance, and who doesn't love a good aspiration, the fact that it's in the midst of an ongoing conflict and the requirement for unanimous agreement among NATO members, well, that makes its near-term inclusion highly unlikely. All right, coming up after the break. Secretary of State Janet Yellen concludes high-level talks in China, issuing a stern warning about potential sanctions linked to Russia's military activities. Also, we examine the disturbing but completely expected trend of China's use of AI for disinformation campaigns aimed at voters in the U.S. and Taiwan. I'll be right back. Welcome back. I want to turn to China and their ongoing financial support for Russia as Putin wages his war in Ukraine. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen issued a harsh warning to the communist regime on Monday, threatening a wave of sanctions if they directly assist Russia's armed forces with the invasion of Ukraine. The remarks came several days into a diplomatic visit by Yellen to China to hold discussions with her Chinese counterpart and other senior CCP officials, and that's according to a CNBC report. U.S. officials have been growing increasingly concerned about the Russia-China relationship amid the backdrop of the war in Ukraine, and of course with renewed aggression in the South China Sea by Xi Jinping's regime. While Yellen was careful to acknowledge that China has every right to maintain a relationship with the Putin regime, and that much of their current trade with Russia is seen as non-problematic by the U.S., any military aid coming from Beijing would immediately trigger severe sanctions. Yellen told CNBC on Sunday, quote, "We stand ready to act if we see significant violations, especially by financial institutions. Anything that involves aiding Russia's military in their brutal war against Ukraine is unacceptable to us, and we have the ability to sanction it." End quote. All right, let's have a show of hands. Who thinks the Xi regime views Yellen's comments as empty threats? After all, the Biden administration hasn't bothered to aggressively sanction Russia's energy industry, which of course is Putin's primary source of revenue, to afford the warmongering. It's unlikely that Xi is concerned about the White House targeting China. It's worth remembering President Biden signed an executive order in December granting the Treasury Department the power to sanction any financial institutions that are engaged with the Russian military, though the Treasury Department has yet to exercise that authority. Tensions are already running high between the U.S. and China, however, and what exactly constitutes direct military support, well, that's a very blurred line. As we know, Russia has had to turn to their allies, they don't have many of them, and that would include China, North Korea, and Iran, to help replenish their wartime resources as the fight in Ukraine enters its third year. While North Korea and Iran have been directly supplying munitions, China has taken a more deliberate and targeted approach, maintaining close financial ties with the Putin regime and providing critical economic support to Russia's industrial base. Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell recently revealed that Russia has nearly fully rebuilt its military capabilities despite facing staggering losses on the battlefields, in large part thanks to China's economic support. Officials said China has greatly accelerated the rebuilding of Russia's defense industrial complex, essentially backfilling the losses left by former European trade partners. Now, while no sanctions are imminent, and by that I mean they're not going to happen, the warning does come amid strained U.S.-China relations. President Biden spoke with Chinese President Xi Jinping over the phone last week. their first conversation since November, although details of the conversation remain unknown. However, shortly after hanging up the phone, Xi authorized a significant incursion into Taiwanese air and naval space by PLA aircraft and naval vessels. Read into that what you will. A senior administration official who briefed reporters said that while the U.S. and China are significantly divided on any number of policy issues, both powers want to ensure that any disagreements between the two are responsibly managed and that the lines of diplomatic communication remain open. Oh, that's nice. Now, to be, possibly cynical, the problem that the U.S. has with the China-U.S. dynamic is that China plays a long game. Their strategic planning looks way down the road. In the U.S., the game is only as long as the election cycle. The Chinese regime moves deliberately and without regard for short-term concerns over the whims or emotions of an electorate. The U.S. administration, frankly any administration, is a bit like a raccoon chasing a shiny tinfoil ball, easily distracted, rarely consistent, and somewhat rabid. All right, sticking with China. Reports have emerged showing the CCP is leveraging artificial intelligence to fuel widespread disinformation operations aimed at the U.S. and Taiwan. That's shocking, and by that I mean there's no shock involved in that at all. A new cyber threat report published by Microsoft found that for the first time, do we really think it's the first time, the Chinese government is employing generative AI tools in their covert state-sponsored influence operations, revealing the CCP has even more advanced cyber capabilities than previously thought, according to a report by the Wall Street Journal. Chinese influence operations have long proliferated on social media platforms in the U.S., seeking to sow political discord and shape the public narrative, specifically regarding the CCP. The Chinese-linked campaigns use fake accounts to push false information on everything from the U.S. drug crisis, immigration policies, racial tensions, and the upcoming presidential election. Microsoft said many accounts are now using a relatively rudimentary AI tool to create images. Tom Burt, Microsoft's head of customer security and trust, said they've seen a marked increase in the amount of activity from Chinese-linked accounts over the past 6 months. Burt told the Wall Street Journal, quote, "We're seeing them experiment. I'm worried about where it might go next," end quote. Microsoft also observed a spike in the use of more sophisticated AI tools by CCP-linked cyber operations targeting Taiwan in January, as the country was holding their presidential elections. In one example, CCP-linked accounts created AI-generated fake audio clips of a former presidential candidate endorsing one of the remaining contenders. Microsoft said it was the first time they've seen a nation-state actor employ artificial intelligence in an attempt to influence a foreign election. Here's a pro tip. Probably wasn't the first time the Chinese regime has done that. Officials at Microsoft said that while these operations typically fail to gain traction, some have had a profound impact. Most notably, following the devastating fires in Maui, Chinese accounts spread conspiratorial narratives that the U.S. government had triggered the fires with, quote, weather weapons. The posts used AI-generated images that spread across dozens of social media sites and were translated into at least 31 languages. That campaign was quarterbacked by the Chinese hacking network known as Spamouflage, or Dragon Bridge, a group we discussed last fall on the PDB. The network operates thousands of accounts at any given time and is designed to foster a perpetual state of fear and paranoia among the American public. But Spamouflage is just one of the many networks of spies and hackers operated by China in their efforts to undermine the West. In March, CIA Director William Burns warned Congress that China will employ their sophisticated networks in an attempt to disrupt the upcoming U.S. presidential election. And that should surprise no one. China, of course, denies that any such networks exist, do they? Okay, coming up in the back of the brief, we'll bring you the latest on the situation in Haiti as the U.S. halts charter flights from the troubled nation. I'll be right back. In today's back of the brief, I wanted to give you an update on the situation in Haiti. After nearly a month of negotiations, Haiti's leaders have put the final touches on a political agreement that will serve as the framework of a 22-month transitional government. That government will ultimately be in charge of returning order to the nation's capital and organizing the swearing in of a new president by February of the year 2026. The transitional government will be comprised of a 9-member ruling council, which includes 7 voting members and 2 non-voting observers. The accord will now go to Prime Minister Ariel Henry, who's still locked out of the country. Henry has to sign off on the agreement before officially handing power over to the transitional government. Now, it remains to be seen if the new government will be able to regain control of Haiti's capital. Armed gunmen still control, frankly, the majority of Port-au-Prince, and sporadic gun battles continue to break out between gang members and an outgunned police force. Residents of Port-au-Prince continue to flee the city, pouring into rural areas to seek refuge. According to the UN, more than 53,000 Haitians have abandoned the country's capital, leading to a growing humanitarian crisis in southern Haiti. And for those Americans still looking to get out of the Caribbean nation, well, time is running out. According to a report in the Miami Herald, the U.S. State Department will stop charter flights from Haiti this week, bringing an end to month-long efforts to evacuate U.S. citizens from the island. And that, my friends, is the President's Daily Brief for Tuesday, 9 April. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at pdb@thefirsttv.com. I'm Mike Baker. I'll be back later today with the PDB Afternoon Bulletin. Until then, stay informed, stay safe, stay cool.